Trump says Iran asked for the Doha meeting. Tehran says it hasn't agreed to meet the U.S. at any level, and both delegations are landing in Qatar anyway. If you're just joining us, here's where things stood going into Doha. Washington and Tehran had only an interim framework. Iran would dilute its enriched uranium, U.S.-backed sanctions would be waived, Hormuz would reopen, and both sides would get 60 days to chase broader terms. Now that track is strained by a fight over whether direct talks were ever scheduled, plus open questions on inspections, frozen assets, and sanctions relief.
This is Iran War Daily. So the diplomats are on the ground, while Iran's calling Hormuz sensitive and complex. And CENTCOM's chief is off running his own Beirut to Tel Aviv shuttle. 2 American negotiating lanes, 0 explanation of how they connect. Let's dig in.
Annahar has the details on this one. Annahar's headline calls these indirect Doha talks, and indirect is the key word. The Americans and Iranians are in the same city, not the same room, and Tehran is still saying publicly it never agreed to meet Washington at any level.
Indirect. So Witkoff's on one floor, the Iranian delegation's on another, and Qatar's running notes up and down the elevator. That's the whole trust level right there.
Still, it moves the diplomacy along. On the deal track, Doha is happening, even as Tehran keeps insisting there's no direct U.S. contact. Both things are true at once, and I'm not going to pretend they neatly resolve.
How do you advance a peace deal indirectly, Sarah? Nobody signs a hostage file or a nuclear timeline through a mediator's memo. The form is here. The substance is still vapor.
From Northwest Arkansas Democrat-Gazette.
Dubai, United Arab Emirates. The United States and Iran on Monday separately announced they will send delegations to Qatar this week, though Tehran insisted it has not agreed to meet with the U.S. at any level after attacks across the Persian Gulf over the weekend challenged negotiations to end the war.
Both capitals announced delegations to Doha on Monday, then told 2 different stories about why. Trump says Iran requested the meeting, convening Tuesday. Tehran says it hasn't agreed to meet the U.S. at any level.
So they're both flying to the same city, and one of them swears the other guy won't be in the room. Iran's line is they're there to talk interim deal terms with Qatar, not Washington.
So that's where the record sits, both sides, side by side, and unresolved. And it comes right after weekend strikes across the Persian Gulf, with both sides only seeming to pause on Monday.
And here's what nobody's pricing in. 1/5 of the world's oil used to move through Hormuz before this war. Rubio and Witkoff are briefing the full House and Senate this afternoon on a deal that's supposed to reopen it. I'd love to hear how they square open the strait with 4 days of trading fire.
From leaders.
The U.S. Embassy in Lebanon said that the meeting focused on discussing the path forward and the official launching of the framework's implementation, looking to build on the momentum generated by this agreement quickly and tangibly. This framework builds a realistic path out of the current conflict and establishes a clear and structured process to restore Lebanon's sovereignty and disarm Hezbollah, the U.S. Embassy statement added.
CENTCOM says Admiral Brad Cooper met President Joseph Aoun and LAF Commander Rodolphe Heikel in Beirut, then went on to Israel, all on the trilateral framework signed in Washington on Friday.
So while the Doha delegations are working the nuclear and sanctions lane, the CENTCOM commander is personally doing a Beirut to Tel Aviv loop on Lebanon. Those tracks are both American, both urgent, and nobody's explaining how they fit together.
This is the first high-level military follow-up since the signing, per leaders, and the U.S. Embassy language is the official launching of the framework's implementation, which is diplomatic for we haven't actually started yet.
Right. You don't fly your 4-star to 2 capitals 5 days after a signing ceremony because everything's going smoothly. Cooper's there to push something that's already dragging. And the South Litani withdrawal timeline is the part nobody's putting a date on.
The issue is whether Cooper's trip is procedural or a signal the implementation has stalled. CENTCOM's statement calls it the path forward, which tells us the direction and nothing about the calendar. Here's Alex Sunby at CBS News.
Iran's foreign ministry denied Monday that its negotiators would be meeting with U.S. officials in Qatar on Tuesday after President Trump announced the talks would resume at Tehran's request. Both sides exchanged strikes over the weekend, testing the fragile ceasefire.
So Iran's foreign ministry calls Hormuz sensitive and complex. And that's the same week they're flying a delegation to Doha. If the choke point were actually on the table, you don't reach for language that vague.
It's careful wording, Rich. Compare it to what the IRGC was putting out around June 30th, asserting management authority over strait navigation. Sensitive and complex is a step back from that.
A step back rhetorically, but Witkoff and Kushner can't close on strait security with a mood. What does the delegation actually say when someone in that Doha room asks about Hormuz?
That's the part to watch. And per CBS, that phrase comes from the foreign ministry, not the IRGC, which tells you something about who's writing Tehran's line this week.
Two Iranian voices, one straight. The diplomats soften it, the Guard hardens it, and shipping insurers are supposed to price that.
If Iran War Daily helps you stay on top of the latest, consider subscribing wherever you're listening. And if you can, leave a quick review. It helps other people find the show. What we're watching next. The interim U.S.-Iran deal starts a 60-day clock for both sides to work toward broader agreements on uranium dilution, sanctions relief, and the Strait of Hormuz. You'll find links to every story we covered today in the show notes. So if you want to go deeper, you can follow them there. That's Iran War Daily for today. This is a Lantern podcast.